Hi,
Hi,
we're back again.
we're back.
Is that how I start every episode?
I think it is actually.
You say something.
I think you. Well, no, I'm just enjoying my day.
The quiet.
The quiet. Spring is coming.
I mean, let's talk about the last few days. The weather was glorious.
Oh, it has been lovely. It makes such a difference.
It
You know
does.
what? Those days when you come out of work and it's still light, and you think, "Wow, we are coming out of that hibernation." And actually, I will pause and say, I genuinely believe that is something that we've lost as a society because we are meant to hibernate and not quite as animals hibernate. But I genuinely believe, when we talk about cycle awareness, we're meant to slow down over the winter months. We're meant to change our pace because it's not normal to just power through in darkness. I mean, you'll say that if you lived in Norway, I suppose, in northern Norway, that would be pretty tricky.
But in last week's episode, we did talk about the importance of light, and your body rhythm being, and maybe people who live in darkness a lot, that's also evolution, right? That's generation. Whereas here where we live, it's really not up until artificial light.
Yeah, that we changed our pace, right? That's it. And I think, and if you think about, it's what you said about evolution, that mismatch, that evolutionary mismatch between the way we live our lives, but our kind of biology hasn't caught up with that yet.
We're going too fast.
So we're going way too fast.
I love that we took no time to dive straight to dive straight into the topic. I mean, leave that with us. We can talk about this all day, every day.
All day long, exactly.
Welcome to Not Designed for the Grind, the PRGality podcast about women's health, hormones, and the power of understanding your cycle.
I'm Dr. Katerina Bambang, consultant gynecologist and reproductive medicine subspecialist, and also founder of the Delphi Clinic.
And I'm Marlou. I'm a social entrepreneur, TEDx speaker, and founder of Period Reality and JAG. We bring together science and storytelling to change the way we understand women's health.
Every week we'll have honest conversations, we'll challenge outdated myths, and give you fresh perspectives on women's health.
And we're in our menstrual phase today. This is where we slow down, take stock, and have the conversations that require honesty. Let's begin. Today is about menstruation.
Yeah.
And heavy bleeding.
Well,
I suppose circle though. We've done, I know we haven't done our deep dive on menstruation yet, but we've walked through all of the four phases.
Yeah, that's true. And I guess it's just moving on to acknowledging as well that not all cycles are healthy cycles. That we've kind of talked about what the expectation of a cycle should be roughly, but acknowledging also that lots and lots of women around the world don't have that kind of cycle, and that their cycle may be totally different. They might have really heavy bleeding, their cycle might be completely irregular. There's lots of variations, isn't there? And acknowledging that actually that's a space where that awareness is really important as well.
And we try to be very intentional around the language we use, right? I don't mind calling that out right from the get-go of even when we say a normal cycle, or we try to be intentional around saying an average cycle, we know that there's guidelines between quote unquote what is normal, it's important to name that as well, to say if it's not this, to almost give people permission to seek support and
exactly
consult a healthcare provider. So maybe that's where we should start.
That's a good point, actually. And you'd expect an average cycle to be roughly between 21 to 35 days. Some people will say 23 to 33. I think either or is fine. And then you'd expect to bleed. Women tend to bleed anywhere between sort of 3 to 5 days, roughly. Bleeding about between 5 to 7 tablespoons of blood. That's in the entire period. So you can imagine there's a lot of women that are way outside of that. When, they're reporting sort of heavy periods. Now that can change. It's really interesting because teenagers will often are much more likely to have heavier periods. And then women in their 40s are also more likely to have heavier periods. And that's those kind of fluctuating hormones that behave slightly differently in those phases compared to kind of the middle. But yeah, that's what you would probably call average. And then there's variations. Again, what we talk about you as an individual, because some women will say, well, actually, my cycle doesn't quite fit into that.
Well, I think even before we, dive into some of those details, like when you say 5 to 7 tablespoons,
Yeah,
I think there's very little people who know how much blood they actually lose
they
now. I think
lose.
if I
Yeah.
think about my own experience, like, and the products I've used from, being a teenager and starting out with just pads at some ponds, only recently experimenting with like the menstrual cup. I think it's only, when you start using a menstrual cup or
Yeah,
something
that
that
you can
makes it so
actually see the
physical.
amount of
Yeah.
blood. Yeah, that's so true. And do you know what the other thing is? There's a different absorbency between one pad to another. So one pad will soak really rapidly, and one has a lot more, can take a lot more. So it's also really difficult when you ask women, when women will tell you, well, I'll soak a pad in an hour. I mean, that's definitely not healthy, but there's also variation in how much that pad can actually hold. So you're right, the amounts are tricky, but you shouldn't be, on average, you certainly shouldn't be soaking, 3 or 4 pads a day. You shouldn't be filling that many a day for 5 days. That's not your average cycle. That's more bleeding than you should have. And the thing is, you'll find some women who will say, well, that's what I've always been like. So then it's getting that balance between when is it that it's now a problem, versus that's fine. I
And I
don't
assume
have.
as soon as it starts impacting their overall health, right? And
Yeah,
when they might start
exactly.
to feel not tired but exhausted and things like
Exhausted.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And even the tiredness, actually, because it's remembering that, that's quite a lot of iron lost. If you think about your iron levels, if you are bleeding heavily, that's probably a big one. And what I guess we were talking about it in the last episode as well, about being depleted. If you become iron depleted during your
Yeah.
period, and then you spend the next 3 weeks, your body's spending the
Trying
next
to
three
get
weeks
caught
trying to
up.
kind of get caught up, and then as soon as you're caught up, you're bleeding again. That's, you're just on a hamster wheel then, aren't you?
So what are from like a doctor's perspective, like what are the things that people can keep an eye out? Because we talk a lot about tracking and when we normally talk about tracking, it's obviously when do you start bleeding, how long does your bleed last for, so that you understand your cycle. And other than that, it's a lot of variation in how you feel or your mood or your
Yeah.
so physically knowing it's hard to track how much blood loss there is, like what are things people could be looking out for?
I think anything where, you're soaking, if you're soaking pads really rapidly, so, within the hour or 2 hours, if you're flooding, so if you're having episodes where literally you can just feel the blood coming away from you onto your clothes, and it's heavy for days, if you're now finding yourself having a really full period for 7 days, that's not your average cycle. And particularly if it's associated with clots as well, if you're passing lots of
Yeah.
clots as well as that flooding, that I would say I would seek some support or certainly some additional investigations, and see your doctor, because that's not what you would want to see, and that is definitely going to deplete you. And then it's thinking about the things that you can do to support your health, because that's going to affect you. We were talking about premenstrual syndrome, right? And how it affects your mood. But if you think about how this would affect you in terms of the workplace and getting out of the house and the fear of what clothes am I going to wear, you're constantly scanning and thinking, oh, is it okay to walk out in this? I don't know what's going to happen. So it can be, I can imagine it would be quite daunting, and a time that's quite stressful. Obviously you go into the workplace quite a bit. Have you heard any stories from women
Yeah,
about this?
absolutely. And I think it's the thing that it's problematic on many different levels, because it's obviously for the women itself, it's horrific that it happens, and you want to support them and thinking about ways to help them manage their situation. But then it's also often a culture where that cannot be named, which means that whether or not you come into the workplace, even if you don't, you call in sick, you don't feel safe to share that with your manager. So there's then also nothing that's being done on a workplace perspective to help create safer and better and more supportive environments for that to actually be solved. So it's because it's not raised as a problem, it's not being solved, which that is a real issue, I think, because it's that hidden.
It's that hidden worry.
And what managers often don't realize is that when you do show up, you're constantly distracted about, when I get up from my seat, will someone see it? Will I leave? Where do I get changed? Did I bring spare clothes? What is it? The toilet cubicles are too small. Like, how do I? And that is distracting people from actually showing up to work as well.
Being productive. So can I ask you a question, actually? What are your thoughts on menstrual leave versus sick leave?
Oh,
because
it's controversial.
I know, I'm so sorry. I thought it might be, but I thought, I'm going to go there. Yeah, because I know obviously Spain's introduced menstrual leave, haven't they? And and I'm interested in knowing what your thoughts are about the difference between the two, and what you think.
Yeah, I like that. Well, when Spain introduced this, it was just about the time we got started with period reality and jibe. And I kind of got to see all the attention and the increase of awareness that it brought. And I think with anything that, if a topic or a subject is almost being pulled out of the taboo and the, out of the shadow into the light, I think it's quite normal that that you're going through a phase of transition of finding out what the right balance is, right? So from a gut feeling perspective, it was great that it happened, because it just sparked a lot of conversation, not just in Spain, not just in Europe, but around the world. Because people were looking at Spain, people were talking about it. People were either supportive of it or against it, but at least we were talking about menstrual health in the workplace. And I think we hadn't done that much up until that point, right? And I know there's great examples from other places as well, but I know that for me, this was the first thing I saw in mainstream being so openly discussed. Now, personally, I think there is a risk that it also takes the responsibility away from the workplace to actually do something to support women stay in work. And I think if you look at, 10 women in the workplace, there might be one of them that is actually incapable of working because of underlying conditions. And your sick policy should be strong enough to support that person because there is an underlying condition. 9 out of 10 women should be able to do their job if reasonable adjustments
are flexibility,
and if there's support that was offered. And I think that is where there is an exciting opportunity for businesses, because it's like, actually, we can, by supporting our menstruating health force, menstruating workforce and health force, menstrual health force. And by supporting them, we don't just get to keep them in work, but have these hidden, conversational problems that we don't talk about, but we actually support them in a way that they show up feeling confident, that they show up being present, that they show up. And I think that is a really exciting opportunity for businesses now to tune into that and do something about that. And then offering menstrual leave is kind of a bit of can be seen as a cop-out then.
Yeah. And from a medical perspective, I was thinking there as you were speaking, because actually my concern would then be, we're normalizing cycles that are not healthy. And actually, again, for so many years, we've told women that actually, yes, they're meant to be painful. Yes, they're meant to, they're heavy. Yeah, that's periods for you. You've just got to put up with it. And I feel like if we're saying, oh, you can have menstrual leave, where then we can lose all of those cycles in there as well. Oh, well, I have to take my 3 days off every month because my periods are so painful, I just don't cope. And I think, well, we should be helping you with that.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be normalizing that kind of, needing to take that time off without being supported with actually, this is not okay. You need support. You need medical support to get better. So that's my fear. I think it's great, like you say, that it's a conversation happening in the workplace, and that actually women can then speak about their menstrual cycles in the workplace. That's the start.
And I mean, it's very different, right? Because I think, especially from our perspective, living in the UK, having this very Western perspective, I think as soon as we start talking about the workplace, the majority of us will start thinking about, either a desk job or an office job, a corporate job. And I think it's very different in different sectors as well. And especially, having worked with people from around the world, and there was a case study about a group of farmers in India. Like, it's really hard if you're physically in so much pain to actually do the job properly. Yeah. So things like the menstrual leave policy is actually a lifeline for these people. Yeah. So appreciating that people's realities are very different depending on where they are in the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
And being able to, like, and that's why I always think we talk about that in our workplace readiness sessions as well. There is that gap between policies created for the sake of having a policy and people's lived experience.
And you're so right. As long as we don't lose the bigger picture of, we need to support women to have healthy menstrual cycles, right? And so no, you're absolutely right. And can you imagine being a farmer and having that sort of cycle?
Yeah, but you say that, I can think, can you imagine being a doctor on a rota?
Yes, absolutely. Or even someone at an office job who has just flooded and has to get up and go into an office, into a big meeting room with a board, and cannot, and has to present, and is now thinking, oh my word, how do I sort this? Yeah. It is those things that we don't talk about, we don't really think about, but each individual woman will either have experienced an episode like that, or will know someone who has, and it's really hard.
Actually, when you were talking, that I had a bit of a flashback, and I'm going to share quite vulnerably here, but I think it's important that we tell those stories. As you know, and many people know because I talked about it before, is that I experienced 3 miscarriages between having James and Bowie. And that first miscarriage happened when I was about to deliver a workshop about 5.5 hours away from home. So we'd driven up the night before. We were going to stay in a hotel, and then that morning at 9 a.m. we were going to have our workshop. And the miscarriage happened in the middle of the night.
Oh gosh.
Now, I obviously didn't even expect a period. So I had no pads. I had nothing, right? On top of the emotional kind of like wave that hits you when, just being upset, and obviously on the phone with my husband and trying to Google and reading all these messages of like, bleeding can be normal, like spotting. And I'm like, this is not, do you know what I mean? Like you're in that not knowing for sure, but knowing. And I messaged my colleagues. I was there with a colleague, and I said, would you mind grabbing me some breakfast? I don't really feel like joining for breakfast. And then, so he brought me some, like a croissant or whatever to the room. And with some toilet paper in my pants, I delivered a 3-hour workshop, then joined these people for lunch, and then drove 5.5 hours back home.
Oh my Lord.
And I kid you not, like, this was obviously before I was working in this space, but I kid you not, it wasn't until I got home that I thought, why did I do that workshop?
Yeah.
There was a colleague of mine there. We were doing it together. He could have stepped in quite easily.
Yeah.
But it doesn't even, and
doesn't cross your mind.
Isn't that mind blowing? Yeah. And I mean, and the weird thing then is that you feel some kind of pride around how you were able to do it.
But isn't that what we were talking about last week, about that whole powering through, and we have attached so much to doing hard things that that's our value, that's our value system, is that, well, I did this really very difficult thing, and actually it was awful.
Yeah.
But look at me, I did it. And I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that, and they couldn't even tell. I'm really sorry you went through that. That's really awful.
And I appreciate that, but I also, I appreciate that. And I think, to your point, so many of us are carrying stories like this that we often think we're, even if we know we're not alone in them, but there's like a handful of people might be able to resonate or relate. And then you start talking about it, and all of a sudden you realize
everybody has a story. Yeah. So you're so right. I actually don't think this, no, this is a bold statement. I would say, I think the vast majority of women, if we were all in one room, they would all have a story to tell of something that has happened, either in relation to their cycle, in relation to a pregnancy, in relation to something. I mean, you brought up miscarriage. Just thinking about the fact that 1 in 4 to 5 pregnancies ends in a miscarriage. Just that statistic alone. You know, I always say to women I look after, you know, when you're walking in the supermarket, every 4 or 5 women you walk past, one will have had a miscarriage. And it just really brings it home, you know, that, oh gosh, it's so many people. So there's loads of stories that aren't being told.
Yeah. And I think it's, in those situations, you're also relying on kindness of others, right? And in my situation, even if in the moment I just asked my colleague to grab some food, like I could have asked for more support had I felt like, because that was a totally safe environment for me to open up about that. And I ended up sharing it with him on the way back anyway. So that was even I was lucky to be in a safe enough environment.
Yeah. But I think
what you were saying about heavy bleeding as well, like there's so many stories that I've seen lately on social media about like boys offering their cardigan to girls in schools when they see that a girl has leaked through.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't even know why I mentioned boys there, but I think that's
but I think that's
powerful.
So it's super powerful because we're changing the narrative, right? That this is not just a woman's problem, and actually knowing that men, we're raising boys who will become men who understand what an impact a woman's menstrual cycle has on her, I think is huge. And it's funny you brought up schools, because that's the other thing where heavy periods are such a debilitating thing, is for teenagers, teen girls in sport, and I mean, any woman in sport, but especially teenagers who, there's such a drive to get children into sport and to be interested in sports. And you've got teenagers who are swimming, who are, playing football, all of those things that are forced out of it because of the fact that their periods are so debilitating. And that we're not talking about that enough, and that they don't want to swim anymore because it's embarrassing, and what are their options, and it's just to say there is support out there, and there's lots that can be done. And I think it's important that we have the conversation, and rather than young women with so many possibilities just dropping those, so I think it's a really big deal. And then I think there's also this, I don't know if you've seen it on social media, there's a big kind of war, the hormone wars. There's kind of people who are really anti-contraceptive pills, people that are really pro-contraceptive pills being used to manage bleeding. And, I probably sit on the fence. I think there's a place for everything. I think there is a lot of lifestyle support that we should be putting in place that will help periods. And particularly with heavy periods, I think there's lots and lots of different things that can be done. But I think there are certain situations where, there's a place for it, for things like the pill.
Well, and we often say as well, like, it's about being able to make well-informed decisions, right? And we keep saying that, like, knowledge is power. Like, you need to know.
Completely.
You need to know. And then choose what's best for you.
Yeah. And I think that's, you know what, you've hit the nail on the head, because I think that's probably what I'm really against, is that one size fits all solution. So, so someone comes to see me and says, I've got heavy periods, and I say, right, okay, you can take the pill and that's going to make that better. And there you go, without having a detailed conversation to say, well, these are the options in a sort of stepwise way. And
I mean, it happened a lot though. And I think I grew up in the Netherlands, so I'm not exactly, obviously I didn't grow up here in the UK, but I feel like it was pretty similar, that as soon as you're a teenager or a young woman, you go to the doctor with whatever, whether it's like breakouts and agony, or whether it's debilitating pains, or whether it's heavy periods.
Yeah.
It feels like whatever you had,
Here's
you
the
know,
pill.
you were put on the pill.
Yeah, that's so true. And it's the same. It's been the same here. And I think that
And is that still the case? Do you see like some movement around that?
I would say this very gradual movement happening. I think it's so important that it happens because that is what is often offered. And I think the reality is, and I don't want to demonize that, but the reality is it's also often due to lack of time to really address a sort of more global approach, because actually there's so many things that are around that might be underlying those heavy periods, and they can be medical or they can be as simple as certain intolerances that will make you more prone to bleeding. So, it can be something like thyroid problems, it can be something like a bleeding tendency, or it can be something like you have a tendency to a particular intolerance to a specific type of dairy that's making it worse. Or actually you're iron deficient. Bizarrely, iron deficiency makes you have heavier periods. So, there's lots of little things that you can tweak actually from a lifestyle. And this is just sort of scratching the surface, that you could tweak from a lifestyle point of view that actually completely changes your experience.
Yeah.
Or it might be that you need to mix those up with the pill. And, actually those alone don't do it. And you also need the pill. But I think it's tricky.
So for parents of teenage girls who have just visited their GP and get this recommendation, like what would you, is there a bit of guidance we can give here of like...
Yeah, do you know there are resources out there, and we'll probably share them in the show notes for this one, because there is certainly from a nutrition point of view, there's lots of things that can be done to support having sort of a sort of healthy bleed that are related to what girls are eating. And particularly for teenagers, where we know actually it should, if they are having really persistent heavy periods, it should trigger additional investigations, not just the pill. Because I would want to know what their thyroid is doing. I would want to know the certain specific bleeding tendency tests that I would want to do. And then I just want to explore a little bit more certainly their iron levels and their blood count. So there's things there, and we can certainly share some resources.
Yeah, that would be great, because I think another thing I was going to ask you is that sometimes going in to a doctor, I mean, this has come up a couple of times already, of like, be armed with as much information as you possibly can, like track your cycle, have the data there, right? Like make sure you are able to tell your story to the GP in a way that you want to. What are maybe some things that will help GPs listen? Like,
no, and that's so true. And it's acknowledging, if you go to your GP, they've got 10 minutes. And it's taken 2 minutes to get you into the room. So now they have 8 minutes. Yeah. And in that time, they need to really understand the story, understand the right solution, prescribe that right solution, or talk to you about the right solution, and then do all of the notes. So it is an incredibly short time. I just have so much admiration for GPs doing that job. But what you can do to support your story is go in with all the information sort of straight out. So if you walk in and say, right, I started my periods, say you're, I don't know, 19 years old. I started having periods when I was 12. I bleed this often. This is how much I bleed. This is what happens when I bleed. These are the symptoms I feel. I feel drained, I feel sapped. So once you give all of that information and you say, oh, I've also noticed that this happens when, I start to feel breathless when I'm on a period, all of that is really helpful information. So that really makes the doctor think really rapidly and put a sort of more whole picture together. And they can then ask you questions that are relevant. But I think also just feeling strong enough to sort of say, to not be fobbed off if you are, and be able to say, look, these are really affecting my life, and it's not just.
Well, and I think that's what I was hinting at as well, because I think, we've collected some of those quotes once of like, what do you feel like helped your doctor listen to you when you came in? And it is those statements of like, this is impacting my life on a daily basis. Yeah. And this is now affecting my daily activities. And it's things like that your doctor will take you more serious. I mean, as bad as
not
it
so
sounds.
much, yeah, not yeah, and I think not so much just seriously. And you're right. It's just because it's also for you to know and be able to communicate the fact that this is beyond what you think is up. Because again, it's hard, isn't it? When you say my periods are heavy, that's a really broad statement. When you can qualify it with, I can't go out because I don't know what will happen if I do go out, all of a sudden someone's got perspective on what that actually means. So I think that's also really important.
Because when you just said, like, with all the things that you should equip yourself with, of like how much blood you lose, back to our earlier conversation of how hard it is to measure that sometimes, you would say, like, even if it says I'm using 8 pads a day and I soak through them, that type of stuff is also. So even if you don't, I just want to make that point because I hear that so often that people say, but I don't know how much
is
I'm losing.
and it doesn't matter.
Just, quantify by the amount of tampons you use, pads you use, how often you have to change them.
And not even, do you know, the quantifying piece, I would say, so if someone comes in and says to me, I am scared to go out because I don't know what might happen, I probably would pay more attention to that than the number of, because sometimes it's also how it happens, right? So you might not be bleeding throughout the day consistently, but you might have had nothing, flood. And then all of a sudden you just literally flood. And I think that's a big deal to separate as well.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think is quite important, though, also, by the by, don't know, that's just come to me, is that when, if someone does go on the pill, and then sometimes, we have women come back and say, I'm having heavy periods whilst on the pill, it's really important to say they're not periods, they're withdrawal bleeds. And so that's a completely different kettle of fish again. And it's just, how the body's also reacting. And that can happen both in relation to starting the pill because of heavy periods, but also it can happen, some women will start it as a contraceptive and then now they're having these really heavy withdrawal bleeds. They're not periods. So that's a completely different thing.
Can we talk a little bit about the pill? I mean, we've been talking about the pill, but what does the pill do? Because I think that is obviously a conversation we get a lot as well when people say, well, you talk about cycle tracking, like, can I track my cycle when I'm on the pill? Even what you were just saying about these withdrawal bleeds, like what happens hormonally when you're on the pill?
I mean, hormonally, so yeah, that's a really good point. So the pill is actually made up of synthetic estrogen and progesterone. There is a couple of pills now that are using sort of body identical hormones or body identical estrogen, but the rest are synthetic. So what they do is they act differently in that they shut down your cycle. And so you essentially are taking a hormone that flatlines your own cycle so that you're just having the same standard amount of hormone. Now, the action of it on your own estrogen receptors, so where your estrogen would bind to act, is completely different to what your own bodies would be. And so you shut down the cycle, and then essentially what you're doing when you have a bleed is that because you take the pill for 21 days and then use it, or the standard use of the pill, and then you stop for 7 days. So the reason you bleed is essentially because you've stopped those tablets, and that induces a bleed. But it's not actually a normal hormonal cycle, well, your standard hormonal cycle period. So that in and of itself makes it tricky, because actually what you're tracking is not the reactions you would have. Having said that, though, I still think there's a benefit to tracking. Not because you would expect the same cyclical hormonal experience, but actually you might find that there's still specific things that happen at specific times of the month for you. And it's interesting to see what that relationship is for you in relation to the pill. Have you found sort of women giving you those stories?
Absolutely. And I think that's almost the same information we give them when women are going through perimenopause, when they've gone through menopause, to men. Like, there is just a benefit of tracking as a tool to get to know your body a little bit better and how your body is moving throughout different cycles, right? Because we talked about this, like whether it being the seasons or the moon cycle there are still things happening. And even if you have gone through menopause, we always say that the cycles or the rhythm is still there. They're just prolonged ones, right? They might not be monthly, but they just, you might still be picking up on that. But I think I know we've talked about this in an earlier episode of like for me, the cycle tracking is still a tool to get to that point where you get to know your body at a level where you don't need the cycle tracking anymore. You don't need to cycle
track, absolutely.
The only thing we want to know is like, what is my normal? What is my healthiest? How is that translating in how I'm showing up?
How I'm showing up. And I mean, even just, you could even sort of zoom out a little bit and look at it as seasonal tracking. I mean, think about how many people report feeling low in the winter months, and just knowing that, oh, I'm coming up to that time when I'm going to start, my mood is going to change. So I'll amp up, the things that I do differently in order to support myself through that. So yeah, completely. I just think there's so many areas it would help with. So yeah, I think that's probably a good summary.
That's a good summary
of menstruation this week.
Thank you for joining us for Not Designed for the Grind. We love sharing this space with you.
If today's episode resonated, please subscribe and share it with someone who would value a deeper dive into her cycle.
You'll find show notes and further resources at periodreality.org.
And remember, rest is not weakness. Understanding your cycle isn't optional knowledge, it's actually the key to leading your best life. Until next time.
If you would like to reach out to the Not Designed for the Grind team or want to tell us your story, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at podcast@periodreality.org or follow us on Instagram at periodrealityofficial. You can also connect with us directly on Instagram at the.delphi.clinic and at Marlou Cornelissen, or find us on LinkedIn under Dr. Katarina Bambang and Marlou Cornelissen. If you'd like more resources, show notes and updates, visit periodreality.org/podcast. If someone came to mind while you were listening, send them this episode. And if you believe in what we're building, the simplest way to support us is to follow the show on Spotify or subscribe on Apple Podcasts. Ratings and reviews really do help more people find us, and 5-star reviews go a long way. A big thank you to all of you listeners, and please remember, the only thing that is true is what is true for you. Not Designed for the Grind is a podcast by Period Reality. The show is produced by Isabella Lindahl, created and hosted by Dr. Katarina Bambang and myself, Marlou Cornelissen. Audio editing and mixing by Delilah Odima, and our visual branding is developed by Millie Mensa. A special thank you to Favor Asueleman and the incredible team at Period Reality. We'll see you next time.